Hi, everybody. This is Adam Key, and this is my final critique of Katie Brunner's paper, Queering the Bible, Examining the Constraints on Theological Rhetoric and Queer Theory in Matthew Vine's The Gay Debate, the Bible, and Homosexuality. Katie, let me start out by saying, as I have, I think, every single time that I've done a video critique of one of your papers, that I really, really, really like the way you write and really like the way that you've set up this entire thing. Specifically, you start off with this idea of, okay, what is queer theory? And you do a really, really good job of explaining that. I mean, I know what it is, but had I not known, I could have actually gotten a pretty good understanding just by reading your paper. And then you explain what queering is, and then you go on to explain the process by which Vines uses queering to address theological arguments, and then wrap things up pretty nicely with a conclusion, looking at the other implications. We'll get to the conclusion in a second. That actually is an area of concern. So before I get into the areas that you may want to look at a little more, may want to change before you submit for publication, I just definitely want to compliment you on just the excellent way that you set this up, the excellent way that you write. Now, first thing matter of concern, and this may seem like kind of a small thing, but when we're dealing with queer theory and the idea of deleting this whole binary nature of things, it's important to be inclusive. Now, I noticed that you use the acronym LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning. You're missing a letter, specifically if we're going to be, inclusive and delete this whole binary thing. It's actually now LGBTAQ, the A specifically standing for both allies and also people who are asexual, people who do not consider themselves to, have a sexuality at all. And at the point where you're talking about, queer theory or something, you could really, I guess, do something of a queer critique on the idea that you're talking about inclusivity and you're not actually being inclusive in the terminology. Also, I believe one of the quotes you use actually does the GLBT or GLBTQ. People might find that just a bit confusing to see if say, is this really referring to the same thing? People familiar with the acronyms are going to know, but if a person is not, let's say a person is just new to this whole idea of gay rhetoric, then you may want to clarify that they are LGBTQ and GLBTQ are referring to the exact same thing. Okay. Then let's get to the title. Part of me loves the title specifically because it's going to make people want to read it. Just that phrase, queering the Bible. It's almost inflammatory in the idea that it's going to set people with a traditional interpretation off, and they're going to actually want to read and maybe, write responses to it. The problem I have, though, is given my understanding of queering, which is the idea of highlighting normative structures which are used to make heterosexuality seem normal and diminish the importance of gayness or homosexuality or LGBTAQ-ness. I don't think he's actually queering the Bible so much as he's queering the interpretations or queering the theology. Because if your arguments are, and really his arguments rather, would be accepted, the Bible is actually, not condemning gay people, and that it's only because we're misinterpreting it, then it's not really the Bible being queered so much as their interpretations, because he's not showing that the Bible is making heterosexuality normal when actually, homosexuality or other sexualities are just as normal as heterosexuality. He's showing, in fact, that this is something that's being done by the theology. So you may want to address that, although the idea of a paper called Queering the Theology, or, I guess you really could probably call it Queering Christianity, because Christianity is really, a product of theology. Because, that would probably accomplish the same thing as queering the Bible and making people want to read this being a nice, exciting title, which I'm always a fan of. Next, and then this may be kind of a small thing, but especially because I imagine your article, because of the subject matter it addresses, is going to be subject to some pretty intense criticism from, let's just say, the Christian right. You may want to be a little extra careful on what specifically you're using. I noticed at one point you actually you use the New Living Translation of the Bible as a way of reference. The problem with this particular text is that the New Living Translation is not really revered as being a wholly accurate translation of the Bible. It's a popular translation. In fact, it's, I think, the only one since the NIV came out to overwhelm the NIV in popularity. But a lot of theological scholars look at it because, what it was, I forget the guy's name, but there was a guy who wrote a paraphrase of the Bible, looking at the New American Standard and saying, I'm going to paraphrase this, and he called it the Living Bible. Now, the Living Bible wasn't even considered a translation of the Bible. It was considered a book written by the guy. And then because of the intense criticism that they said you're changing the meaning, you're interpreting these things, in your own personal, wins or terminus screen, he called some people in to, kind of fix it up a little bit, and the Living Bible became the New Living Translation. Now, the problem with this is, for instance, the Catholic Church, which is the largest denomination within Christianity, does not regard, from what I read, the New Living Translation as being a valid one. So, when you see that, even if it is, I don't know if it's valid or not valid, but since you're not really arguing about the NLT, you may want to just simply use something like the NIV, which is a pretty universally, the New International Version, which is a pretty universally accepted translation. Again, I think you did an absolutely, positively great job of explaining this concept of queering, and how exactly he's doing this. A person reading this would definitely get a lot. And you also, as always, make a very, very good point of referencing your sources, saying where you got this from. In fact, I don't think there's a single idea that you assert in the paper that you actually couldn't figure out exactly what you were referencing. Let's get to the conclusion for a second. In a conclusion of a paper, it's kind of, at least I'm of the school that should be really a summarization. You start bringing up, I guess, kind of limitations of the study, maybe more, like the idea of, perhaps this could actually be a bad thing because he's not really following a queer theory because he's not being inclusive. It's kind of out of place there, I think. I believe this would be served well in its own subsection because I think the point of a conclusion is really to sum up everything. I'm a debater, so I always make debate references, but the idea is in debate, you're not supposed to make new arguments in your last speech or in your conclusion. You're simply supposed to wrap up and advocate what you've been advocating the entire time. So the presence of new material, I think it's a good argument that you're making, but I really think it's out of place there. I think other, people reading it, especially people who are reviewing your publication, may have the same issue I have. As far as expanding the research itself, I had a couple specific ideas, and this was actually inspired by reading a Chris Outzen paper, looking at Chris Kluwe. Specifically, I think it'd be interesting if at some point in there, talking about queer theory and the justification thereof, you might examine the credibility of Vines himself as a text, because Outzen makes a very good point about the the inherent credibility that Kluwe gets. Because he's a heterosexual white male. This is something that I brought up in a previous critique when we're looking at the idea of credibility. Basically, the idea here is because he is a gay Christian, he's going to be assumed to be inherently biased in favor of a interpretation or translation that's going to favor who he is. For instance, if I'm a person who, I think this is an example I used last time, we're in the Minnesota State University Communication Studies graduate program. So if you published a study saying that MNSU's Communication Studies graduate program is the best one ever, and by the way, I go to MNSU, your credibility is going to be damaged from that. So I think it bears that at least some mention even within this text. I know you're not. You're primarily just looking at the idea of queer theory, not the idea of domination and such. But the idea that essentially, if you're going to look at things like you did with the idea of the switch back and forth, reference in Romans is undermining the point of his speech. I think you may want to look at him as a text as well, and the fact that he may undermine his credibility. Specifically, I've gotten into discussions lately, and I did actually finally watch the full video. Really interesting stuff. And I got into a discussion with a guy who's a pastor down in San Marcos, Texas, where Texas State University is, and because I was trying to get him to watch the video because we're going back and forth over interpretation, and he wouldn't watch it. And I think a large part of the reason was because Vines is gay, and he's a gay Christian, therefore he wasn't going to buy what he had to say because there's a natural inclination against that. So that may undermine his credibility. The second part of undermining credibility has to do with the idea of I guess perceived masculinity. And again, look at Outzen's paper for what he describes there, but. And I don't know the politically correct way to say this, but Vines has the, I guess, stereotypical, I don't want to say accent, but a way of speaking that, when people parody gay people, they tend to use to make fun of them. The idea that, a male person with that accent is rather feminine, is probably homosexual, as opposed to someone like, with a voice like, say, Chris Cluey, who is clearly, meets the standards of masculinity, or gosh, I can't remember it off the top of my head, the NBA player who came out recently as homosexual. But the idea there is he may lose some credibility. One, the fact that obviously he is a gay Christian, but two, obviously in the fact that he doesn't embody this masculinity, which these people who promote this heteronormative idea are going to oppose. So just it may be worth maybe in this paper, maybe another paper, examining Vines himself as a text. That being said, once again, I thought this was a fantastic paper. Just a couple small things. Again, you want to use LGBTAQ in competing with the idea that queer theory is a binary. Oh, sorry, one last thing I forgot. Speaking of queer theory, and you actually addressed this, I think you should carry this a little further. Would Vines's interpretation be construed under the idea of, in addition to opposing queer theory, but also essentially saying that the Bible would say condemn bisexuality? Because, he says they've taken one and abandoned it for the other. Well, that, okay, a gay person, let's accept for the sake of argument that they're born gay. If that's, that was the argument he made, is they never had the chance to change. A bisexual, on the other hand, does change, and, sometimes on a regular basis. So would Vine's argument then actually, in addition to promoting this whole binary back and forth thing, but would it also be saying that the Bible says, okay, being straight is good, being gay is good, but if you're bisexual, you're going to hell? Because I think he really focused a little too much on the GL and not really the BTQ or BTAQ. See, I'm doing it now. Again, but LGBTAQ. Is he really queering the Bible, or is he queering theology? I would suggest the title of Queering Christianity. I wouldn't use the New Living Translation because it's going to bring unnecessary controversy. Great job explaining things. Your conclusion, I think, shouldn't have any new arguments or new information in it. And finally, consider Vines as a text, both in the fact that as a gay Christian, people assume that he's more biased towards a subjective interpretation that supports his own position, and secondly, the idea of his voice being that of what is commonly stereotypically associated with femininity and feminine gay men. All told, I've really enjoyed this. I've really enjoyed this class, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Possibly on some rhetorical projects. Good luck with this, and let me know when you get this published.